What is up, everyone? I am TST's the Mudman, and it's time to figure out what we are going to play this weekend. Last week, the core set refresh came, and Magic was the top dog. It was the best deck by far. If you have not seen my teammate the Professor's YouTube video where he breaks down the previous week's weekend ranked event, definitely check that out so you can see just how dominant Magic was. Literally everyone was playing Magic. But just yesterday, we were hit with a brand new balance patch, substantially nerfing that best Magic deck, while also buffing a whole bunch of light cards. So last week was Magic Weekend, and this week will be Light Weekend. Right now, we're on godsunchained.com, set to Mythic rank at 1 day by God popularity. And that balance patch came out about like 22, 23 hours ago, so this information is not 100% accurate. But as you can see, Light has gone from the least popular god at about like 5% to 9% of the meta, all the way up to the second most popular god, just under the most popular god at 22% of the meta. So we are going to be seeing a lot of Light this weekend, and we're going to look at everything through the lens of if you're not playing Light, then you're playing against Light. So I've got a whole bunch of different Light decks to show you, as well as a few other gods that may be able to perform well against Light. But before we get to that, let's go over each of the gods' most popular archetypes so you know what you're playing when you run into each god this weekend. Magic was the most popular god last week, as we said. Tempo Magic was that super strong deck. It's been nerfed a whole lot, so you probably won't see Tempo Magic. Like Control-y Ramp Magic is still probably good. However, it's only been like about 23 hours since that balance patch came out, so it's going to be tough for people to figure out a good Magic list in time for the weekend ranked event. So Magic probably won't be super popular. Light definitely will be popular. In my opinion, Light fits into two categories. There are the decks that go to 7 mana and have Zealous March, and the ones that don't have Zealous March. Both of them have very similar game plans. They play lots of creatures early on, and they win the game the old-fashioned way. They play a bunch of creatures, they make value trades and go face, then they buff up their creatures and they go face harder. Nature will be the same old mid-range nature deck leaning towards aggression that we know and love. War will most likely be a very aggressive deck. Right now, Aggressive War fits into two archetypes. There is the Aggressive War deck that buffs their creatures with spells, like Another Round or Red Fume Serum, and then there's the Aggressive War decks that buff their relics with I Need a Weapon and Sharpens. Both are very strong. Aggressive decks tend to be pretty good against Light, so aggressive decks may work well. You might also run into some Control-y mid-range War decks. Control mid-range War has historically been good against Light. That being said, Control mid-range War is weaker than it's been in a long time, and Light is stronger than it's ever been, so the jury is still out on if it's still a good matchup. Then we've got Deception, which will probably also be aggressive. Like Aggressive Orrery Deception, Aggressive Deception has also historically been good against Light, and Deception has a lot of really great early game creatures that can test the board and a lot of great early game spells, so Deception is definitely a strong archetype this weekend. And Death, the new Light, least popular god. The best Death deck is, of course, Board Wipe Death. Board Wipe Death's not very prevalent because it's incredibly expensive. It's also inherently weak against a lot of different Light builds. Then the other Death archetype is Zombie Death, which is also weak against Light, so don't expect to see very much Death over the weekend. So let's jump into some archetypes. We're going to start off with the not Light and then talk a whole bunch about Light. So let's jump into some Nature. Alright, so let's start things off with Nature. This is a mid-range aggressive Nature deck made by GG. It's fairly standard, with a few notable changes from the core set refresh. The first interesting card is Arrow of Rage. This is now a 1-mana spell, and it deals your strongest creature's strength to a random enemy creature, so it can potentially be a very powerful removal spell. It hasn't been particularly relevant because Magic has been the best god. Magic has lots of ward, so spells are not particularly good. That being said, Light also has lots of ward, so Arrow of Rage might also be a questionable card for this weekend ranked event. You do have your Selena's Mark God Power to help pop the ward, but I digress. Let's see, we've also got Managar Moonhound. This card was recently nerfed in the most recent balance patch, and now only restores 1 mana upon attacking, so it's a little bit weaker. Still a decent body, still a decent card. Let's see, gotta mention Bale Ward Minotaur because he's so cool. As you can see, this deck has an 8 mana card, a 6 mana card, and no 7 mana cards. That's very rare for a deck in Gods Unchained to go to 8 but skip 7. Well, you don't need to run 7 mana cards anymore because Veilborn Minotaur gives you 7 mana cards. He's just you're like late game in a can. He's a great new addition to nature. Let's see, then we got some more standard stuff, the Minotaur, Sudden Blooms, Hunts, and the last interesting card of note is Hevnir. This is a new core set refresh card. It's an 8 mana 5/5 with Confuse, Frontline, Overkill, and Ward, so it's got all the keywords. And his roar effect is gain +1/+1 for each wild creature in your void, which could be lots of wild creatures. So this is sort of like Nature's Attackers monster. That being said, in this weekend ranked event, we're going to see a lot of light and potentially a lot of zealous marches. So this creature is probably going to come down right after your opponent plays a bunch of 2/2s with protected. So the overkill and big body will not be as relevant as it normally would. So this may not be a great week for this card. But Nature does have a lot of great creatures and a lot of great early game control cards, and the best way to deal with light is to deal with their early game. So there is hope for Nature, although I definitely don't think it's the best god this week. But that is about it for Nature. Let's jump into some War. Alright, next up we have War. This is an aggressive War deck made by Madcap. This War deck uses lots of relics as well as relic buffs to deal lots of damage. The main card in this deck, or the main card from the core set refresh at least, is I Need a Weapon. This is a really strong new spell for War. It's really pushing this aggressive relic-oriented archetype. You draw a relic from your deck and give it +1/+1. Not only is it card draw, which War doesn't have a ton of access to, buffing up a relic's durability and attack is just incredibly powerful. It makes cards like Blade of Sticks' cumulative output go from 6 to 12. It makes it so Scythe the Harvest goes from 8 damage to 15. It just deals a whole lot of damage. And we've also got other big relic buff cards in here. We've got 2 copies of Sharpen, which gives your relic +3 attack, as well as a friendly creature +3 attack. So it can be a little 6 damage burst from hand. It is important to note that if you have a relic equipped but no creatures, you cannot play Sharpen. However, if you have a creature and no relics, you can still play Sharpen. However, you won't buff your face's damage output, just a creature +3. We've also got 2 copies of Whetstone in here, which increase your relic's damage +4 for just 1 mana for even more burst. And we have lots of relic-oriented creatures, 2 copies of Valka's Captain, 2 copies of Leviathan Hunter, as well as 2 copies of Blade of Sticks, so you always have a relic to buff. Besides that, we have a lot of early game creatures and a lot of Vikings. This is a Viking synergy deck. Let's see, we've got these Viking 1 mana 3/1s, which are really great for destroying Bright Mages and Highborn Knights after you pop their protected bubble, which will be very relevant in this light-centric meta. As far as Viking synergy cards are concerned, we have the Deathswarm Raider, which buffs a friendly Viking +2/+1. You have lots of 1 mana Vikings, so you can pip this out on turn 2 for some buffing potential. And a great buff candidate is this Defiant Farmer. This is a 1 mana 1/1 Viking. He's new from the core set refresh. His afterlife is deal 3 damage to your opponent's god. So this is the type of creature that if you play on turn 1, there's a pretty decent chance your opponent won't destroy it, since 1/1s aren't very threatening, and why would you want to take 3 damage to your face? And then you can punish them with your Deathswarm Raider to make it a big threatening creature. Let's see, we've also got the Battle Bard to buff up one of your Vikings so they can either trade up or deal lots of damage. And we have all these relics, which, I talked about before. You can buff them up to make them strong, but they're really great at dealing with light. The best way to beat light, and light's going to be very popular, is to beat them on the board and then use things like relics or blitz creatures to handle their board. So you're capable of building a very strong board state. You have lots of 1 mana creatures, lots of blitzy creatures. You can go wide with your Viking War Maiden. So you can potentially just beat light on the board using your relics to control the board state and then just slowly beating them over time. Or if you're playing against not light, you can use those really strong relics and really strong early game presence to just win the game quickly. So essentially these aggressive relic war zoo decks, I am a big fan of them. I think they're going to be really good in this meta. They're capable of either winning the game really fast or just controlling the board to such a great extent by using their life as a resource with all their relics, as well as the I Need a Weapon. The I Need a Weapon is the shining star of this whole archetype, making your Blade of Sticks just do so much damage or destroy so many creatures. If you don't want to play light and you want to finish your games quickly and explosively, then an aggro war deck like this could be a great option. Alright, next up we've got Deception. This is an aggressive deception deck made by IMO. Aggressive Deception is a very powerful archetype right now, and historically, aggressive deception decks have done very well against light, and that will be important because light should be very popular this weekend. Just like we said with the war deck, a great way to beat light is to contest their board state early. This deck has lots of great early game creatures. You've of course got your Pyramid Wardens, you've got your Orpheos, who are just great for taking great value trades. Patient Pickpocket is a creature that gets you resources. Your light opponents will probably have great cards, so stealing their cards will be great. We've got the Selfless Guild Maiden here, which is a new card from the core set refresh. It is a 1-mana 1/1 who's hidden for a turn, and he gives one of your friendly guild creatures +3 attack. That is very strong in order to make your Patient Pickpocket's attack more relevant, so it can either be threatening or take, some good trades. It also makes your Switch Duelist into a great big threat, and it is incredibly powerful with Armor Lurker, making Armor Lurker 6 attack with 2 armor. It should be able to take a value trade with literally anything on the board at that stage of the game. We've also got some great control spells. Your Stoneskin Poison can slow down / destroy any of your opposing light opponent's creatures, even if they're warded. We've got a Makeshift Shiv in here, which is great for popping protected bubbles as well as controlling the early game board state or getting favor. Let's see, we've got the Hollow in here, as every Deception deck does. The Hollow is just really great. It helps you, maintain lots of resources in your hand, so you can continuously trade off your board state against Light's board state, but still have resources to play afterwards. The same thing can be said with Ludi's Dedicant, another great way to just generate more resources so you don't run out of gas. Let's see, now we've got the Shade Walker in here. This is a very threatening card. Light has a hard time dealing with any hidden creature. This deck has lots of hidden creatures, and this one has a very high attack total, so your light opponents won't be able to interact with it, and you can just go face with it and hide it again and just race your opponent down. This deck list also has Hierophant, not Hephaestus, for even more value generation if you need it. We've of course got the Lantern-Bound Fae because it's just a decent, board control card. You have lots of order stuff in here. Of course, you've got your Hollow and your Patient Pickpocket, but this deck also has 2 copies of Shackled Acolyte, which is questionable because it can be Light's levied. But your light opponent can only have 2 levies; they can't levy everything. And this is a creature that can potentially get very large and take lots of value trades and/or be threatening. Let's see, another important thing to note is this deck has 2 copies of Guild Enforcer. Guild Enforcer is always a good card. It's always convenient with Orpheos Distraction God Power. You can buff it up with Dark Knives or even with a Selfless Guildmate, and then Orpheos Distract him over and over again to just race your opponent down. It's also just a really good card against Light in general. It can't be Light's levied, obviously, having 3 attack. And oftentimes Light deals with the big front lines by making its health 2 with either Master of Indulgence or the 2-mana spell that has the same effect as Master of Indulgence. And this creature's 1 armor will make it so your light opponent can't destroy it with a 2-attack Relic or a 2-attack Acolyte. They'll have to throw 2 resources into it. So, Guild Enforcer, definitely a good card in this meta. But yeah, that is pretty much it. Aggro Deception, still a very strong archetype. Just like War, if you don't want to play light, but you still want to be successful, Aggressive Deception could be a great archetype for you. Alright, now we are finally on to light, which will probably be the strongest domain for this weekend ranked event. I've got 4 different light decks to show you today. Like I said in the beginning of the video, I'm categorizing light into 2 different categories. The ones that go to 7 mana with Zealous March, and the ones that don't have Zealous March. We're going to start off with the decks that don't go to 7 mana. And the first list we have here was made by Orcavilli. This is a fairly normal Zoo Light list, except for the core set refresh has given it lots of new powerful tools. And in this most recent patch, we've had a couple of buffs. The most notable ones go to Vexing Vicar, which Caution Fund likes to refer to as Newborn Knight, because it's like a baby highborn knight. And then, of course, we have the Shield Bearer, which is now back to his former glory, a 1-mana 1/1 that gives a creature +1/+1. And all of the players who were around when Shield Bearer was a 1/1 remember just how powerful this card is. It may not look flashy, but this card is really, really strong. Let's see, as far as core set refresh cards are concerned, we've also got the Mace of Calling, a new light relic. This relic is really powerful. 2 mana 2/3, it adds a 1 mana 2/2 acolyte to your hand. So the 3 durability on this relic means it's probably going to destroy 3 of your opposing creatures, and then you have another acolyte, which might destroy a 4th creature. So it's essentially one card that deals with 4 other cards. That's really great. Let's see, we've also got Militant Theist, another new core set refresh card. This is a 3 mana 2/3. You target a creature. If it's a friendly creature, it gets +1/+1, just like fellow Janissary or Shield Bearer. But if you target an opposing creature, it gets -1/-1, which will be convenient for either, taking favorable trades or maybe even making a creature, a 3-attack creature, like leviable. And then, of course, we've got Wrong Paths, which is an incredibly frustrating card for all Light's opponents. A 3 mana spell that pulls an enemy creature onto the top of their deck, and then you draw a card. So this goes through Ward. It essentially just takes away one of your opponent's turns. By putting a creature not in their hand but on top of their deck, they essentially don't draw a card. What will often happen is your opponent will just play the exact same creature they played the turn before, just redoing their turn. You get to draw a card, which is nice. And if you're in like the relative late game when your opponent is like mainly top decking, putting the creature back on the top of their deck is really devastating. This is an incredibly strong single target removal card for Light, and it's funny that it's at 3 mana because it is just like Light's Levy, another one of the strongest single target removal cards in the game. Everyone knows Light's Levy, it's been the same forever, but now that Light's finally relevant, let's talk about one of Light's best cards. 3 mana spell, target a creature with 2 or less strength, turn into a 2/2 acolyte. You gain control of that 2/2 acolyte. Light does not have very many comeback mechanic cards, but Light's Levy is an incredibly strong one. Let's see, we've also got Prayers of the Desperate, another new core set refresh card. This was also buffed in the most recent balance patch. It's a 5 mana spell that buffs all of your creatures +2/+2. No prerequisites, doesn't matter what its starting attack total was at, it just buffs everything +2/+2. Huge AoE buff. Turns Light's like moderately threatening board into an extremely threatening board. But besides these new cards, the strategy for these Zoo Light decks are just like how they've always been. You play lots of creatures in the early game. This deck list has lots of great early game creatures. We've got the Vanguard Axewoman, the Netherborn Binder, the Drider Sail Weavers, the Vexing Vicars, all of which are the Pyramid Wardens, I don't know if I mentioned that. All those are excellent targets for Shield Bearers and fellow Janissary buffs. Also got the Minosian Infiltrators, which will be really great in the mirror matches to destroy your opposing Pyramid Wardens, or if you do happen to run into Magic, it still destroys All-Seeing Spires very successfully. But yeah, Light got an extreme upgrade. Zoo Light should be really strong, and let's jump into the next aggressive Zoo archetype. Alright, so this aggressive Zoo list was made by me, the Mudman. And this one is a little bit different. We're going to do the same thing we just did, go over the core set refresh cards first. So we've got the Aging Veteran, which was just buffed from a 2 mana card to a 1 mana card. It is a 0/3 initially, and its effect is at the end of your turn, if this creature has 3 health or more, it gains +1 strength. It naturally has 3 health, so it's already going to be gaining 1 strength. And this is a card that's particularly good in the mirror match, in combination with that Shield Bearer we talked about. If you go first and you play Aging Veteran and Shield Bearer on turn 1, by the time they have enough mana to Light's Levy your Aging Veteran, it'll have too much attack. And that is very difficult for Light to deal with. Let's see, as far as core set refresh cards that are in this deck but not the last deck, we've got Call of Light, which is a new resource generation card for Light. 2 mana spell that adds 3 acolytes to your hand. The acolytes, of course, being 1 mana 2/2s. And this is really convenient because Light likes having big, wide board states. Light likes buffing their creatures. They're sometimes incentivized to play multiple creatures at one time, and this is just a good reload tool for Light. We've got those Mace of Callings because they're so good. This deck also has 2 copies of Serene Blade, which was very substantially buffed in the during the core set refresh. It's now 3 mana. When you summon a creature, you give it +1/+1 and ward. You have lots of 1 mana creatures. We have that Aging Veteran that we talked about. There's also the Empyrean Pacifist. There's Pyramid Warden. All these cards love getting +1/+1 and ward. It's also very powerful in combination with the aforementioned Call to Light. It puts 3 1-mana acolytes in your hand. You can play all 3 of them, and instead of being boring old 2/2s, they'll be 3/3s with Ward, which is very strong. So you got Highborn Knights, that's obvious. Master of Indulgence, that's fairly obvious. Got Radiant Dawn, this was all, or not Radiant Dawn, I'm sorry, Radiant Embalmer. This was recently buffed in the core set refresh as well. It now has 4 health, so it's a more passable creature for 4 mana, and you can get any card from your void and put it back into your hand. With this deck, more often than not, I'm just getting more Calls of Light so I can continue spilling wave after wave of creatures onto the board. Of course, we've got the Prayer of the Desperate, just like in the last deck. Buffs your entire board. This deck is really good at making boards. And then, of course, you have Asterius as well to also buff the boards. These aggressive creature-centric light decks have been really strong. There are just so many great creatures and great cards just all throughout the curve, especially in the early game. The Imperium Pacifist, alongside all of these 1-mana creatures, as well as generated 1-mana creatures, just gets out of control very early. If you play an Imperium Pacifist on turn 1, especially alongside a Shield Bearer, it's likely that it just never dies the entire game. But yeah, that is about it for the light decks that end before 7 mana. Let's jump into some of those later curve light decks. Okay, and now we are on to our light decks that go all the way up to 7 mana. This first list was made by Mirage88. Gods Unchained, GUDecks.com categorizes this as a control deck because it has Zealous March, but this is a classic example of a mid-range deck. It is incredibly similar to the more aggressive light list that we just looked at, except for, of course, it goes all the way up to Zealous March. But the game plan is essentially the same. You play creatures all throughout the game, you buff those creatures up, you make value trades and go face, and you beat your opponent. But one thing that Mirage did that I really like is he put extra emphasis on this recently buffed Shield Bearer. As you can see, Mirage has a Skeletal Hoplite in here, which none of the other light lists we've discussed has. This is a great creature to buff with either your Shield Bearer or your Fallow Janissary. It's not particularly good in the mirror match, because if you do buff this with a Shield Bearer, it has 2 attack, which means it can be Lights Levied. But in every other matchup, it is an incredibly strong buff candidate. We, of course, also have the Vanguard Axewoman, which is great for trading when buffed, the Pyramid Warden, which obviously gets even better when buffed, the Imperium Pacifist, which, as we discussed before, great when buffed. We've got the Vexing Vicar in here, which I don't know if I've mentioned before, but if you play Vexing Vicar and Shield Bearer on turn 1, on turn 2 you can play Fellow Janissary, and then you have essentially a Highborn Knight that can attack as well as a 2/2 and a 1/1, which is just crazy. Let's see, we of course have the Mace of Calling, just like the other light decks. Just a fantastic relic, does lots of board control, generates you creatures, does damage, gets favored, does all the things. Let's see, Mirage also has a copy of Radiant Dawn in here. So not only is this just even more AoE buff to, increase the power of your existing board state, if you happen to run into Board Wipe Death running this list, you are even stronger than you normally would be, because of the anti-sleep tech. We, of course, have the Wrong Pass in here because it's arguably one of the best cards in the entire game. Let's see, we've got the 2 copies of Prayer of the Desperate, just like all the other light decks, so you can buff up all your creatures, kill your opponent. This light deck has a copy of Canonize, which is usually a light staple card. However, the last 2 light decks we showed did not have any Canonizes in it. Mirage has 1 copy of Canonize, and he also has a copy of Porphyrion. Can you imagine a better canonized target than a Porphyrion? Excellent combination of cards. And then the next important thing to note is the Zealous March itself. This card was changed during the core set refresh. It used to cost 8 mana. Now it costs 7. It fills your board up with 2/2 Acolytes and then gives them all protected. And if you happen to have creatures on your board when you play Zealous March, it protects those creatures. So if your board's empty, it is a 12/12 with protected. If your board has stuff, it's however many Acolytes you can fit, and the rest of your junk gets protected. It is very powerful. 12/12 on its own is threatening, but when you have cards like Asterius, as well as the Prayer, it can become incredibly powerful. Like, this is a great incentive to get to 7 mana for light. It's just very hard to deal with. Hence why so many of these light decks have chosen to go all the way up to 7 mana. But now let's jump into our last later curve light deck. This one was made by Rockhenge, and I would also categorize this as a mid-range, mid-range deck. However, but this one is more control-oriented than the last list made by Mirage. Let's see, this deck has 2 copies of that Militant Theist, which is great for buffing your own stuff or weakening your opponent's stuff so you can make easier trades or levy them, just like we said before. One thing that I think is interesting with this deck is it has 2 copies of Golden Saber. Golden Saber is an Etherbots card. It's very expensive. It has the exact same stats as the new Mace, and it's too early on to say for sure that Mace is just always better than Golden Saber. But at least in my opinion, it seems like Mace is just substantially better, and Mace is also substantially cheaper. So if you wanted to slot in 2 Maces into this list, it would probably be good. Let's see. Rockhenge also has a copy of Radiant Dawn to play against those anti-sleep decks. Wrong path, of course. But then we get to a very interesting card in this deck. This is one of the more this is the most control-y like card that we've seen in this video. With Excommunicate, you pull an enemy creature from the board and put it onto the bottom of their deck, and then you gain 7 favor. These light decks they go to 7 mana, of course, but very rarely is your opponent going to draw their entire deck. And this card only becomes weak if your opponent can get through their entire deck, which will happen almost never. So this might as well be a 5 mana card that just destroys any creature that goes through ward. It negates Afterlife. It's just very powerful. And now that light is going to 7 mana, there's no reason not to run a great 5 mana removal card now that you don't need to end the game by 5. Besides that, Rockhenge has a few more control-y tools in the deck. He has 2 copies of Iron-Tooth Goblin, which is very good. Not only are relics just very prevalent in the meta in general, light itself runs lots of relics, and light will be very popular, so 2 copies of Iron-Tooth Goblin doesn't seem bad. We've got the Minosian Infiltrator, which is great against opposing Pyramid Wardens. We got the Athenian Archer, which can pop protected bubbles or ward bubbles, so it's very convenient. But yeah, besides that, this light deck is quite similar to the other light decks we've been discussing. You play creatures, you buff the creatures, you take value trades, you go face, you win the game. This deck is just a little more control-oriented than the other 2, with that Excommunicate, with those 2 7-mana Zealous Marches. But that is about it for the later game light analysis. There is no conclusion for this video, because this one is obvious. This is light weekend. You play light, or you're just being contrary. But whatever you go with, make sure you have fun. Tell us how you did in the TST Discord, and have a wonderful day. Hey, you! Did you know that subscribing to the TST YouTube channel will increase your win rate by 6.9%? So what are you waiting for? Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for notifications. And while you're at it, equip Scythe of the Harvest and attack the like button directly in the face. Bye-bye!